let me start this as a question. Flood risk resilience and mitigation always seems to be focused on large structural projects and hard infrastructure. How do we move the needle towards more non-structural and nature-based approaches? Gerry, I'm going to start with you and we'll work back this way, okay?
A statistic.
You got to pick up your mic.
A statistic was thrown out this morning or yesterday that said, as you look at the world as a whole, all the money goes into recovery and not into the mitigation pre-disaster. And in that pre-disaster, the little bit goes in, most of it goes to structural, because when you only have a little bit, you go about the immediate nature. We've got to change the mindset to get people to believe what we've been saying on this stage, is that if you put the money up front, pre-disaster, it's going to pay back, and that will allow some running room for the natural systems, nature-based approaches.
So we're obviously working on this, and we're really working on it from a couple aspects to promote nature as a risk-based solution. We're creating data decision support tools that are very accessible for folks to use in assessing their vulnerability, but then presenting different types of natural solutions like building oyster reefs in the Gulf or setting back levees and riverine systems. And so they can see on these GIS-based tools what the risk reduction value might be from some of those components. So really putting that, arming that information aimed at local planners to be able to really see that. We're also doing demonstration projects around the country and really so people can go see and we can start measuring, monitoring what the exact effectiveness of these different techniques are. And that's really important to kind of spread the word. And ultimately, it really is about proving that effectiveness. And there is more work to be done in that regard in terms of really measuring, monitoring, getting that data. And so finally, that is something that we're working on as well. And you know, really that cost effectiveness too. So cost benefit and cost benefit of gray versus green. And we've done some work with Swiss Re in that regard. So those are all ways that we're working on it and really trying to push the needle.
So let me just build on what Gerry and Sarah have said. I think that the point that you made, Gerry, which is critical, is that you have to tie together what happens beforehand with what happens afterwards, and that people have to appreciate the fact that if they don't do a set of things beforehand, they're going to have to pay afterwards. And the point that you were making, Sarah, that I think is really important as we see it, is that there are real short-run benefits with respect to what one can do today on the nature side, and that if people could appreciate the enjoyment of nature on various levels, but also the benefits that that's going to provide in the long term by taking certain steps now that will actually complement a number of other things. You have an opportunity for people then to sort of pay attention to this because they recognize that they are getting something now, but at the same time they are committing themselves to a long-term future, which is something they should begin to appreciate. And it's the tying together of what we can do before and those benefits with what we really need to do in the long term. And I think that relates to the climate change problem as well, that we really, really have to focus on. Otherwise, people are going to say, we don't care about this, it's not going to happen to us, we're not going to worry about this, and as a result, they're not going to pay attention.
To kind of build right off of that, when you look at the National Disaster Resilience Competition, there are 5 factors. The 5th factor is long-term commitment. And when you read through the NOFA, you see that points are assessed based on the long-term commitment that communities and states are looking to change to provide this institutionalization of a legacy of resilience going forward. And I think that in looking at this, the most ineffective, or I'm sorry, not ineffective, believe me, they're not the most ineffective. The most inexpensive ways of doing this is doing these programmatic changes. Looking at building codes, looking at these small changes that can be done that are inexpensive to go forward. And that's exactly what the point of the NDRC was to begin with, was to change this mentality of simply going from project to project to project, gray infrastructure, in these piecemeal approaches to resilience and looking at a more broad, comprehensive, overall approach to it.
Yeah, great. Well, I get to bring us across the finish line, and it's a pleasure. Building on the great remarks that this whole panel has made, I think it's really about making sure that, that local governments understand the true costs and the ongoing carrying costs of whatever choice they're making. And if they are choosing to go down a path with regard to a more structural approach, they are going to be responsible for the ongoing, what I would call the care and feeding of that structure, whatever it may be. And so it's very important to be informing those front-end decisions with understanding what it's going to take to maintain that measure into perpetuity. I would say that every tool has to be on the table, though, and the idea is not to say one should never go with a structural approach. I think it's making sure that it's appropriate to the landscape, that folks are making informed decisions and understand those costs over time, and are taking responsibility for that. Many, many are, and you're in this audience, and we thank you for that. And you're also recognizing that you can't just go structural, you've got to be complementing that with the greener options and that sort of sage approach, but also the non-structural and programmatic measures with your strong building codes and your land use planning. So it's really that full palette approach, but understanding there are going to be costs in the long run for the choices that you make.
All right, so I've got lots of questions. So we will not have the time for everybody to respond to every question. So when I bring up a question, I'm going to ask who wishes to respond, and if somebody else has something to add of value, that's fine, go ahead. But we'll kind of limit the discussion, not have everyone respond to every question, okay? We have a lot of good questions, by the way. Thank you for that. Good job, audience. Here's a good one. Do you feel local hazard mitigation plans do a good job of identifying mitigation action items? And I'm going to add to that, and actually getting some good mitigation implemented, flowing from the plans themselves. Who would like to respond to that? Sarah?
I'll take a crack, and I'm sure others will add. But I don't think they've done a great job to date. I think what I have heard, and we have folks who have done training and outreach to try to inform good mitigation planning, is it's been a little bit more of a cookie cutter approach. And that's unfortunate because it's a real opportunity to do some really good planning, bring together the multidisciplinary teams of folks to provide input to those plans. And to really consider all aspects. So really, we're trying to promote the notion that nature should be woven into those plans and the tool that nature can provide, and that's an uphill swim, and it's been tough to try to promote that because it's not kind of seen as the standard component that folks have thought of when they put together those plans.
Lynsey?
So that's what I used to do for the state of Wisconsin, was mitigation planning. I reviewed all the local plans, I maintained our state plan, and I have to say that I totally agree with you. The local plans just became a method to the funding and nothing more. It wasn't looking at these really great comprehensive approaches. And we kind of go back and forth on this too, and we have all these separate plans at the federal level. We have the long-range transportation plans that communities have to do, the mitigation plans, your comprehensive plans, your consolidated plans. We have all of these plans that are almost, it ends up being you're working at odds with all of these because you're trying to get them all done so that you maintain your funding. And I think there has to be some level of integration with a lot of these to make them more beneficial and more purposeful at the local level. I know I keep referring to the NDRC, but that was one of the things written into the factors, was looking at how we're incorporating mitigation plans into your consolidated plan, into your comprehensive plan, into your long-term transportation plans. And so with that, I think it was last week we were at a conference at the National Association of Development Organizations that was dealing with regional plans. And I had a local come up to me and say, where can I get money to do resiliency planning? And I was like, oh my gosh, like it's there. I mean, it's there. It's your local mitigation plan. And it's trying to make those links and understanding what it is used for, and that it is used for you guys, as locals and states, to develop and formulate a resilience action to move forward and not just to get the federal funding.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Just to add, and what they said, amplified. Yeah, that integration is absolutely key, and I think also this is something that the State Local Tribal Leaders Task Force really pressed as well, and so in response to that, the administration and FEMA have announced the inclusion of climate considerations in state hazard mitigation planning. There's guidance out on that, and then the guidance for tribes and local governments is to come. So I think we're making some incremental steps from the administration side, but that integration with the land use and comprehensive and capital improvement planning is just critical. The best plans out there do that integration well.
I'm not going to ask you this question, Lynsey, but when the NDRC grants are made, one of the things we're going to be looking for is an analysis of what kind of activities those grants funded. Is it going to be a lot of hard structures? Is it going to be nature-based? Is it going to be, so we're going to be very anxious to see what goes on there.
Me too.
All right, here's a question that I'm really not going to ask the panel, but I think it's important enough that I'm going to answer. Oh, that sounds kind of bad. I didn't mean it that way, okay?
Okay, you have control.
But I mean, I know the answer to this, and I think it's important. If we haven't picked that up this week, the question is, what does it take to LiDAR the whole nation the same way North Carolina is? Mm-hmm. That is exactly what USGS is doing right now with their 3 Dept program.
Why don't we get this?
And the cost for that is going to be about $800 million, and it will take about 8 years to do it. USGS is partnering with other agencies, including state and local agencies, DOTs, and so on, to put together this patchwork quilt of, and FEMA, by the way, is using the 3 Dept stuff that they're producing for their flood mapping. So if they take a map of the whole county or watershed, FEMA funds this, DOT funds this, so on, and when they get done, what's not filled in, GS will use their money to fill in, and then they'll do the whole thing. So this 3 Dept program that USGS is doing to LiDAR the nation with 2LQ, two quality level data, the same stuff that John was talking about, will be about 8 years and 800 million. So that's kind of where we are in LiDAR, and that's a very important step forward. Now here's a question back for the panel. Why should federal taxpayers fund a flood insurance subsidy and vouchers? What are the pros and cons of shifting that cost to the communities? Howard, I'm going to let you start with that one.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's a critical question that we have to ask. First of all, it's a question of who should pay, which is on the table when you ask that question. And I think there are 2 ways to maybe approach this. One is to sort of say we may all have some responsibility when we're dealing with low-income people and dealing with people who can't afford. And we can argue and debate that point, but if affordability is an issue, and it clearly has been an issue, as we know, in the Congress in terms of what has happened to the flood program, that has to be put on the table. The other part, and I think is most important, is to the extent that we can provide help now to assist in mitigation, we will all be saving money in the long run. And I think it's the tie-in with respect to the steps that are taken before a disaster and the recovery cost afterwards in disaster relief. When you look at what has happened with the federal government in terms of what it is spending on disaster relief, and that isn't just on the individual homeowner, but on infrastructure and on public facilities, we can see that having gone up enormously in recent years, and the data is there and it speaks for itself. So to the extent that one can move in the direction of trying to aid communities, trying to aid people who need this, we are going to save a great deal of money in the long term. And we have to address that issue now, because we know, and I think all of you can imagine, suppose that Florida has a major hurricane in 2016, 3 months before the election. What is going to happen with respect to funding and helping that? And we have all the evidence to suggest there's going to be an enormous amount of support and real relief on political grounds. I think the answer, Larry, to that question, or at least my answer is, we have to link what's happening beforehand with what is going to be happening afterwards. And if we don't make that link, we're going to be in real trouble in terms of being able to deal with this. We also have to have an issue on the table of equity and affordability and fairness. And I think we have to address that issue issue in a way, and there's no easy answer to that, but that is at least something we have to consider.
I think we also need to rise out of the National Flood Insurance Program and recognize that if we don't start addressing some of these issues, the case of business interruption, if everybody in a community is gone, the factory, as well protected as it might be, isn't going to run.
Yep.
And the business is going to shut
That's
down.
right.
It may shift somewhere else. It could be, it in fact is in many cases, a national security issue. So when we look at this, we've got to look at the total cost to the community and to the region and to the nation of these flood shutdowns. And a small investment in mitigation has a big payoff across the whole economic sphere.
You raise an issue that I'd like the panel to address. How are we going to get the answer to what do floods really cost the nation? And I'm talking about all the costs related to floods. Any ideas? Is that happening? Is MidFlag going to get to that? Any responses to that?
Well, I don't think anybody's doing very much about it. Maybe Sam can jump in and say, but I recall that in 1999, when Larry Johnson was doing the national assessment, and Gilbert brought together 10 people to look at an assessment of the assessment, he said the biggest problem is we don't get the data. We have the flood, we stop the information as soon as the disaster is declared, we don't store it. In our report for the National Academy, we said we've got to have a data clearinghouse, we've got to know and get this long-term look at it so we can make the judgments that you're talking about. But right now, in some cases we don't want to know, and in other cases we stop getting the information because it's in the too hard box and we put it aside.
Right.
Do you want to say something, Sam, first?
Oh, go right ahead, and then I'll
Okay. We don't have, just on the data, we don't have all the data to be able to answer that question right now. And it comes back to the earlier point that you were raising on what John Dorman has done with respect to North Carolina. You need data on elevation of homes. You need to know, this is on the flood problem, you need to know essentially what these homes are. You need the maps, obviously, as Gerry was talking about, and as I know Sam and others are working on with respect to what can be done to be able to say what the risk is, and we need better maps. We have to bring the climate change into the picture and the longer term to understand that. So I think that the question of what is the right question on what it costs, but somehow we've got to actually say these data have to be produced, and it's important to sort of do that now, but we just don't have that data to answer that question.
Yeah, correct. While we are at the administration embarking on numerous studies and really looking at everything from the value of ecosystems, what is the return on different mitigation measures as investments, what we don't have is an understanding of exactly what you've raised, which is what are the true costs of floods in the United States. And it was, in many respects called for in various studies over the years, and we have yet to really respond to that question. I think we can quantify some of it in terms of disaster payouts and claims to the NFIP and claims to private insurance, but we are not capturing what the impacts are that are uninsured, that are not quantified. We certainly aren't capturing the economic disruption and the disruption to commerce. Today, we don't have an answer to that question.
Right. The bigger things that are being thrown out are the $10 billion a year. Well, it's probably closer to $100 billion a year. And it's really important that we know that. If people think if Congress thinks they're dealing with a $10 billion issue, that's a whole different magnitude than dealing with a $100 billion issue. So it's important that we do this.
And just one last point, and it comes back to what Gerry said, the indirect costs are often not really captured by all of this. And if you begin to somehow look at what is going to happen with business interruption, with communities getting back on their feet, and also the psychological costs and these other costs and the social costs, they're not often put on the table. So these are underestimates of what these actual costs would be.
Yeah, it's... after Katrina, it was years later we start to see the mental health costs that came in. Those aren't accounted for. We look at direct damages up front and not the long-term costs. Here's one for the panel. Currently, there are very few incentives for communities, states to manage risk. How do we slowly and clearly push financial risk for flood to the communities and states? Sam?
Sure, I think we're getting there. And again, this was a very strong recommendation from the State Local Tribal Leaders Task Force. And we heard them loud and clear at the White House and in the administration. So we are looking across the federal government, not just at disaster relief programs where we know we can be driving some incentives and driving some good choices, but across the Sunny Day programs, the ones that invest in infrastructure and in economic development. And looking at ways that we can be recognizing and incentivizing communities that are adopting strong standards, adopting strong building codes, and seeing where we can be through everything from sliding cost shares to eligibility provisions and modifying those, and even working with the private sector, with insurers and lenders to find ways that they can be recognizing and incentivizing those choices in everything from their underwriting to other business models. So this is something we're very strongly committed to, and we would really also welcome your ideas where there are specific programs that you think are ripe for this modernization. Let us know, share that information with us, and we can be looking at ways that we can be reforming that.
Others, Howard.
Just one, the community rating system in the flood program is a model that could help communities with respect to all of the individuals. I think to the extent that communities have an opportunity to improve their activities and then know they're going to get an insurance premium discount as a result of that. And there are communities, they're not very many, that are actually getting 40 to 45% discounts on their insurance premiums by virtue of some of the steps they're taking. That could be combined with a lot of the work that I think you're doing, Lynsey, in terms of that competition, the Resilience Roundtable that we've been talking about, which is picking up communities that are actually now taking steps to really bring all of the various functions together, and there are three, and was mentioned, as Gerry mentioned, Charleston and Seattle and Cedar Rapids, and if they can serve as models for this, then you are in a position where other communities could possibly follow suit and understand things that they could be doing.
One of the things a lot of us would like to see is a tie between how good a community is doing and their cost share for disaster relief. Unfortunately, that process is upside down right now. The less a community does to reduce risk, the more apt they are to get 100% federal assistance after the disaster. Somehow that needs to be turned. That's almost a base closure issue. To get Congress to vote for that is going to be next to impossible. So somehow we're going to have to gradually set up a slower system to make that happen, but ultimately that has to happen. We cannot continue to subsidize at-risk development, and that's essentially what's happening. The taxpayer, the national taxpayer is paying for that, so that's the challenge that we all face. So here's a good one. All the rules and regulations mean nothing without effective enforcement for well-prepared local officials. How can we get the federal government to support and empower local code officials with education to mitigate between disaster events? This kind of there's two parts to this. One's kind of the enforcement issue. The other is what efforts can we do for education and training for local officials and support for them doing good enforcement? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, go right ahead.
Well, it's clearly needed. The interesting part, Maryland, our Center for Disaster Resilience, did an evaluation of the National Dam Safety Program 2 years ago. And that's a critical issue. When a state has thousands of dams and has 2 inspectors, you know, what kind of inspection are you going to get? Even if they get there, do they have the money to do the right things? And the answer was, as we looked through and talked to lots of people, the federal government needs to incentivize at every level of the local government the participation. Put the guilt trip on these people. You're putting people at risk. You've got to tell them what their responsibilities are, and then you've got to provide the effective training. And FEMA does a good job in many of the things they do. It's getting them the incentive to send the people to the training and then to carry the message to the state legislators and the local officials that you need to properly staff the enforcement agencies. That's not going to be easy, but it's something that needs to be done.
Here's at least a thought on the short run, long term in terms of education. everyone who is in a political position and a community position, or whatever, and it isn't just the local officials, it's the homeowners as well, sort of have what we term the Nimtoff philosophy. I don't know how many of you heard that expression. Not in my term of office. If I can avoid it, I will want to avoid it. And so when you see essentially the likelihood of a flood, 1 in 100, and a low number, you say, I'm not going to worry about it, it's not going to happen to me. So one way, at least, is messaging is really important. And I think that there's a lot of research that's been done that says if you can frame problems in a slightly different way, you may get people to pay attention. So if instead of saying that it's a 1 in 100 chance of a flood occurring next year, you say if you're in your community for the next 25 years, and this is without climate change being put on the table, just an independent set of floods without increased risk, it's a greater than 1 in 5 chance that you'll have at least one flood during that time. Those two probabilities are absolutely identical. But what we found in experiments that are done, and this is done with students who are supposed to know statistics well, that people are willing to react much, much more to the 1 in 5 and paying for an insurance premium for next year and whatever they're going to do. So I think the idea of messaging coupled with economic incentives so that you can have some short-term benefits are ways for education on the community side for people to pay attention.
Yesterday, Sam, you mentioned, and you might want to talk about it, the litigious nature of society and the liability issue that's being picked up by local officials when they, in fact, don't do what should be done.
Well, and that's a short run.
Well, and yeah, you absolutely anticipated my comment, which is, you know, sometimes it's not just about the federal government coming in. And, you know, in a lot of cases, the market is helping to sort some of this out. But quite honestly, in the absence of strong public policy or practice, the courts are coming into play. And I do think that there are trends where communities and private actors are reconsidering their potential legal liabilities for things like failure to enforce or failure to make sure that their staff are well trained and certified and have the professional development and skills that they need to be performing in that function. That is something that is now showing up in litigation and is showing up in those trends. There's certainly a federal role here in incentivizing robust enforcement and making sure that at every level of government and across the sectors, actors are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But there's also these other branches of government as well, and the courts are playing a role there.
Let me give one example. We had done a book on Chile and looked at the earthquake after 2010 with a couple of my colleagues on a book we just finished. And here's what Chile does that it would be interesting to see whether one could possibly do in the United States. With respect to building codes, and Chile is very well enforced, the developer is responsible for any damage to that building for 10 years after the building is constructed, and they can go to prison and if it turns out that they haven't done it. And the question is, that's a liability, and people really pay attention in Chile to that for that reason. We don't know of any other country, and we've raised the question, could we possibly move in that direction in the United States and have that kind of
I would say there's nothing stopping any legislature from taking
Well, we got all the local and community people here. Can we move? But I mean, obviously, that's a challenge.
All right. While incremental progress is being made in floodplain management policy, political resistance remains significant and driven largely by parochial interest. What are the prospects for the greatest policy advancements at the state, regional, and community level? What do you think the prospects? How can we help the state locals be more effective? What things should we push first that could be most effective?
We took a look at Maryland's Living Shoreline legislation, which is really really groundbreaking in that it requires the default of living shoreline, and you have to opt out. You have to prove why it's not going to work, and they base it on a map, so it's based on science. And so we were looking at, what were the components that went into successfully enacting that? And it wasn't just that they kind of decided to pass this law. It really took, a decade's worth of work leading up to that, which was really various components of that. But it was a series of demonstration projects, so really demonstrating having places where it touched down, where it was showing that people could see visibly where this was working, a series of local champions who were promoting this approach and who were spreading the word and who were trusted advisors. And so, really it's going to take that kind of various components coming together in order to advance kind of innovative state policy. But there is another example. My colleague Bob Carey's here from Washington State, where we're working and helped stand up the Floodplain by Design program. And the reason that's so successful is because it brought together the salmon community, the salmon protection community, the flood local commissioners, and the farmers, and it brought together this alliance to create this state pot of funding that's now being very successfully used for these multi-benefit projects and really showing some success. So now it's up for reauthorization and upping the amount, I think, up to 40-something million in the coming year. And it has this really broad-based political support. So we're really we're very hopeful at the state level that a lot can be done, but there needs to be kind of these various components in place to build up to support that policy.
Gerry.
Russ Honore hit the nail on the head yesterday. Leadership has a lot to do with this. Look at California in the year 2006, 7, and 8, when Governor Schwarzenegger and others got behind worrying about floods, passed liability legislation, changed the standards. Governor Rendell in Pennsylvania changed many things, brought in people that were interested. Mayor Bloomberg did the same thing. In my state, Maryland, Governor O'Malley took it on himself for 8 years to push many of these issues. So my advice is we need to ask questions of people we're about to elect. Are they concerned about this, and are they going to do something about it? Because if people will lead, the people will follow. But you've got to have somebody that stands up and says, I'm a leader.
I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said the biggest threat to democracy is an uninformed electorate.
That's fair.
And that's part of our problem. You're absolutely right, Gerry.
Larry, I would just add, I think the prospects for achieving more at the state and local, and I would add the regional level and working with the tribes are excellent. I think those prospects, frankly, have never been better. In some ways, it's because we do have a very constrained federal role here. This is something where state and local governments and communities and tribes are the first and last line of defense against the next big flood and the next flood disaster. And that's you all. You are that first and last line of defense. And so it's really that skill and that leadership that I think is coming to bear. But we're also seeing, fewer federal dollars that are available.
Right.
And in a constrained environment like that, it's just right for that state and local leadership, that public-private partnership, and that innovation again, those laboratories of policy that you all work in. I would say be bold, take it back. And educate your elected officials, educate your legislatures, and don't wait for federal leadership on this. We're going to do everything we can, but continue to lead the way and lean in at that local government level.
I think you're right. There's innovation in a lot of ways. The federal government's catching up. The flood risk standard was essentially that. They're catching up with what states and locals are doing. We have a lot of progressive communities. And we just need to help share that information with others and help the others move to that level. Let me ask you this. An idea to help individuals move toward mitigation is to give tax breaks for mitigation activities. If you undertake an acceptable activity, you would get a tax break. first of all, a deduction. You'd be able to deduct all or at least part of that cost in your tax. First of all, do you support that? And then secondly, how do we make this happen? Can we get Congress to move in that direction? And what do we need to do to help Congress understand the importance of doing it?
Well, I think it's anything that gives people credit is in the spirit of dealing with affordability. Ideally, you would really like to deal it at the very local level with the property tax as a basis for dealing with it, have things tied to the property, give people a tax credit. That has happened in communities in Berkeley, California, when people have actually instituted mitigation measures. They actually do get a tax credit. Instead of their property value going up, instead of the taxes going up, they're actually rewarded, and when they sell their house, they actually there's a benefit passed on. So there are communities that have done that. And so to the extent that one uses taxes, it's a very, very effective way of dealing with it. And the challenge, I think, that the question is raising, are you able to do that at the federal level? I think it's more at the local and community level that you'd have a better opportunity, and I think it would be harder to get that at the federal level, but it would be the same principle as a voucher. It would just sort of say it would come out on taxes. On the low-income people, though, there would have to be maybe a rebate because they may not be paying all that much in taxes to start with, so you could do it in that fashion, and that would certainly be one way to deal with it.
Others? Okay. How do we convince homeowners that flood insurance and loss reduction measures are ways to protect themselves against future floods? What do we do to convince that property owner the need for flood insurance and for mitigation?
Require it. Enforce the requirement that the federally insured mortgages, I mean, that hasn't been as well enforced as we could. Provide better information along the lines in terms of focus on a worst case scenario and say to someone, if you don't have insurance and you think you're going to get the relief that you hope the government is, you may not get it. You're only going to get $30,000 at a maximum from FEMA the way it is right now. So let people know that a scenario is such that when they aren't protected, they are in trouble afterwards. Rather than focusing on the low probability of it's not going to happen to me, really focus on on constructing something so that they are at least in a position where they may want to pay attention to this.
I mean, just going back, oh, sorry. I was just saying, just going back to what Gerry said earlier, just simply providing the information on a property level to be accessible on your handheld device that you could pull up and say, this is how many flood claims this property's had, this is in the flood plain, this is the base flood elevation. Just simply doing that would be a game changer, I think. So that would be the one thing that I would recommend.
That's perhaps the carrot. The stick is, if you go back to the National Academy report on the NFIP and levies, you'll see the statistics are horrible in terms of the people that are buying that should be buying. In some communities, we're talking about 20% of the people. And then when you find out why, you know, the people don't have to buy the insurance. The bank has to enforce it. The law is on the bank, and the bank has to be inspected. And when we went to the agencies that were doing the inspecting, they said, we're cutting the number of inspectors we have. It's like the IRS. Let's collect more taxes, but let's cut the number of people that are inspecting the taxes. You can't have it both ways. And if we want to have a program that's going to be mandatory, I learned in the Army in 38 years that the troops do what the commander inspects. And if they know the inspectors aren't going to be around, or there aren't enough, or they're not going to inspect it, that's not going to move ahead with mandatory insurance. If you're calling it mandatory, enforce it.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to ask, Lynsey, I have one specific question of you, and then I have a final question I want everyone on the panel to answer before we end. Lynsey, the question of you, and this is a good one. A lot of applicants for NDRC grants won't get dollars. There'll be many more applications than dollars. Mm-hmm. So how do you think that you and HUD and the program will capture this, compile the good ideas, and circle back to try to help those communities?
Absolutely, great question. So we actually have a couple different thoughts going forward with this because, like you said, a lot more projects than funding available. We have two really great, I think, ideas going forward. Rockefeller is going to be working with philanthropy to work with all of the applicants that came through to kind of work on, it's been coined, Harriet Tregoning, who's at HUD, she's been coining this the Shark Tank of Resilience. So we're going to try to pair up applicants with philanthropy and have them pitch their ideas for resilience to see whether philanthropy would be able to help fund those programs. Another side to this is looking at the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. This is a program that was set up about 6 years ago now, looking to pair HUD with DOT, with EPA, with USDA, and all of those individuals have participated in the NDRC to this point, and we are going to be looking and trying to pull the applications together to see if, the NDRC won't be able to fund it, whether there are any other federal programs out there to canvass and look at for potential funding opportunities.
Very good. All right, so first of all, well, let me do this. Let me ask the final question and then I'll get to the quote. If you were invited to this same panel in 2025, 10 years from now, what would be the headlines, accomplishments that you'd want to be able to report and that you actually think might be possible? Be as specific as you can. Let me start with you, Sam.
Well, without question that, 10 years on from the implementation of EO 13690 and the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, and being able to quantify the ways that that implementation has reduced the costs of future flood disasters and has enabled state and local government to continue to lead the way. I think that that's the headline that I would look forward to bringing. And as the interagency works to renew the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard from 2015 going forward, that we have excellent data on the continued refinements of that EO and that standard going forward, because we have a robust interagency team that has continued to work from 2015 to 2025. And those relationships are strong and in place, and we have that strong interagency team moving forward. That's probably one of the biggest headlines that I would like to bring. And then, of course, knowing through the work at every level of government, the ways that that is reducing the costs of a flood. So if we sit here in 2025 and we look back on the intervening floods, we're able to talk about the way that they were not disasters, because we're able to put dollar amounts on the return on investment for mitigation. We're looking forward to being able to see some of that even with these floods in the Southern Plains and say the investments that were made in Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas reduced the cost of the Memorial Day floods in quantifiable ways. So being able to do that is, I think, a critical function that we ought to be able to get stronger on by 2025.
Very good. Lynsey.
I would love, and it started right now, and I alluded to it earlier, but in 2025, I would love to see mitigation included in every phase of emergency management, in every opportunity and planning at the local level, because I think that for the longest time, mitigation has been this kind of like push aside in emergency management. You focus on recovery, you're focused on response, we're doing the preparedness, but like mitigation is this one that's holding out in the corner here, and we'll bring it in when we have HMGP or PDM or whatever is available. And I would love to see it incorporated in every phase of emergency management. It is the only phase of emergency management that can be brought in, but then once again, further expanded at the local level. I mean, just completely change the way we are spending our dollars, the way that locals and states are moving forward and developing policy and having this eye to disaster reduction, disaster losses reduction, and overall just cooperation and cross-technical capacity.
Howard.
I like both of these ideas, and let me add a third one to it. I would like to see a public-private partnership that comes together with the National Flood Insurance Program as a part of that, What that would mean is that insurers and the private sector would put mitigation up front like they did in the 19th century. They wouldn't give an insurance policy unless the factory was safe, and at that point they issued a policy. And I would like to see mitigation up front as a part of the way, and you'll need risk-based rates to do that. But I would also like to see in the federal government coming in and providing the catastrophic potential that would be necessary for the private sector to be able to market it in terms of covering the very, very large losses. You absolutely have to have that for the private sector to be part of it. And then, as a part of this, it's the other policy tools that have to complement that. The well-enforced building codes and land use regulations and other things that are going to make this happen that we've been talking about. And what I would really love to see is all the stakeholders coming and appreciating what the flood risk is. So the real estate community, the builders, the developers, the people who are really making all of this happen, appreciating the fact that we have to do things now, today, in order to avoid the long-term problems that we'll face in the future.
So I'll end with what I started with. It would be achieving our goal, which is really this mainstreaming of nature as a risk reduction tool, and really mainstreaming that both in the private sector, the public sector, through public policy, through all of our programs, and really getting to a level where it's not an anomaly that we're thinking about it in hazard mitigation planning, but it's an essential component of that hazard mitigation planning. And I'll also add that I'm very bullish on the millennials as well, in terms of we really can make some leapfrogs here in terms of technology and really, really change the game in terms of risk awareness. We have technology now that will allow us to do that. So I really think in 2025 we will have achieved that.
I'm like you, Sarah. I'm looking forward to being here in 2025 when the Goddard White Award is given to a new firm, Splash, that works with Google, and they've got this new app that you can't go to a building that's under construction and not check out what the risks are, the hazards are, and what's been done about it. And if you want, you're considering, it gives you all the mitigation measures that can be put into place, the expected costs of that, so that the public at large, the new generation, is totally involved in decisions by their governments and in their own lives in building in the right place at the right time with the right mitigation already built into it.